and some time together. Feel free to be able to grab some more goodies, some more coffee, as we continue having this time of conversation with one another. So as we transition our time, then let's transition here with a word of prayer. Gracious God, we praise and we thank you that you are faithful, that you are the God who is there for us, you are the God who is by our side, and you are the God who forgives us and guides us and gives us your incredible word. And so, Lord, thank you. And we pray for your blessings upon us as we continue this time of conversation together. We pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so before we hop into our Islam study, and especially getting into what Muslims believe about the Quran, is there any kind of quick questions or brief questions from the message, from the readings, from last week in general?
When you talk about, that Noah is one of their prophets, do they also believe in the flood? And if they believe in the flood, this is what hit my head when I go home last week. How do they explain the animals coming in 2 by 2 if it wasn't God?
Oh, okay. And so for Muslims, then since Noah was one of their big prophets, then what do they believe in the flood? And I would say in general, yes. Again, there's different, what we call denominations. They don't use the term denominations, but different types of Muslims and types of Islam. But in general, I would say they do believe in the flood that I've come across. It's not really as much. I haven't really come across much flood stuff in reading about kind of Islam stuff, and for kind of one of the hallmarks of Islam, and we'll use this as we transition to our handouts and stuff. Islam is one of those religions based a lot on works, and so that it's more important kind of what you do than necessarily what you believe. And so now, of course, you have to believe, kind of their main creed. There is no God but Allah. Allah is one, and Muhammad is his prophet. So you've got to believe that, and so you got to believe kind of that basics, But beyond a lot of that, it's not as important the details of what you believe as much as it is what you do. Do you meet the 5 times of prayer a day? Do you have the obligatory kind of giving to charity? Do you make the once in a life pilgrimage, to Mecca? Kind of hitting those 5 pillars of Islam. It's more about what you do. And so when it gets into kind of precise details of, what do you believe about this? Sometimes it's hard to pin it down because from a Muslim perspective, it'd be like, who cares? Allah is God. Muhammad is his prophet. So they don't really kind of get into as much flood stuff or kind of details like that, like we would.
They don't explain why Noah is a prophet or Abraham or Moses, or they just throw it out there and say, you just do what we tell you to do.
They don't get into explaining as much kind of why Noah or them is kind of like their main prophets. Correct. Yeah, they don't. It just is. These are just kind of the main prophets. They don't get into some of the details of them as much. All right, and so I know we've probably got a bunch more questions on Islam. So let's get our handout out. Let's do our video. So on the Quran, and then we'll come back to kind of our Islam questions. Just because we've got lots of questions, which is good. That's the purpose of this time together. So we'll for sure get in our video. So we've got, again, our 2 handouts. And so we've got the kind of the shortened kind of the Cliff Notes note-taking handout. Then there's the full packet handout that comes with the study. And so Lyle was saying that Kyle's been working hard at work all week. And so Kyle can have the nice light handout, and that Lyle wants to take the big heavy one. So thank you guys. So these are the same handouts that we've had the last couple of weeks. So if you've already got yours, you've been taking notes in the margins on. you can still be able to use yours. So then reminder recap, kind of where we're at. Our session leader here is walking through the basics of Islam, and he kind of he does it in a very kind of efficient, time efficient, compact way where he packs a lot into just like a few minutes. And so the video that we'll go to now is the one that we just ended with at the end of last week. We just kind of did it and answered like a couple of questions and then left with a cliffhanger. So now we're kind of picking back up with the Quran because the Quran is huge to them. And it's very important to them and very high respect for the Quran. And so it's worthwhile to be able to take some time. And so we're going to watch this video. It's about 5 minutes. We'll go through the basics of the Quran, and then we'll come back to answering questions about Quran, and I'll answer questions as best I can. And then and open up the floor then for our other Islam questions as well. So let's hop into the Quran.
Part 2, right?
Yes. All right, questions? Questions, thoughts? Again, there's a lot of information that comes in a short amount of time, so we gotta do video, kind of discussion, response, video, discussion, response. Yes?
Are women equal to men in the Quran?
No.
Is there some advantage for a woman to actually believe?
Are women equal to men in the Quran?
Work safety. So are they treated? They're not treated equally. And I guess I want to know, why would I as a woman want to be a Muslim?
Oh, all right. So then what does the Quran say about kind of women, and are they considered equal? And then are they, and then kind of the follow-up question then, as a woman, I'm not a woman, the woman's asking a question. So as a woman, then why would you want to be a Muslim? Good questions. So in the Quran, and this will come back when we get into their into heaven, or kind of their version of kind of the afterlife and the 70 virgins and stuff. This will come back when we get into that section a little bit more. But in the quick version is it depends on the kind of branch denomination of Islam and the strictness of it, how strict they are. But I would say even in the more lax or loose or liberal, or I'm not quite sure what term you would use for that branch of Islam, but the more loose following rule version of Islam, even there, women would not be equal to men in that women and wives are understood as a part of men's kind of property, as an extension of them as their property. And so it goes all the way from like super strict, where like can women kind of like, pretty much like can't even like speak outside the household. Like if anybody but their immediate family is seeing them, like everything but their eyes has to be covered. They have to walk, 15 feet behind the man. If they're out in public, they have to walk 15 feet behind them going down the sidewalk, sort of thing. Super strict, all the way to, their head covering, maybe just kind of more like a little bonnet sort of thing, just a loose thing. It's not covering the face or any neck or anything, just a little bit on the top. And they can drive and have jobs and own property and everything. So it's kind of a big range in there. So does that answer that's kind of a quick version of kind of Quran teaching that I've understood so far with women. Whereas like in scripture, we would say like men and women are equal. They're different, but equal. kind of equal but distinct. And so like men and women have different roles and different capacities, and we have perform and function differently as men and women in Scripture, but we are equal. So then follow-up question then, as a woman, then why would you want to be a Muslim? Right. I guess I would say right offhand that I would consider that as a very even asking that question is a very Western, or even it can be more specific. And when I say Western, like Western Hemisphere, like the Americas, and even more specifically, a very American style question. In lots of parts of the world, that wouldn't even be a question. And so it wouldn't even be a question of like, why would I want to be a Muslim? It's, I am. This is what my country, this is what my government is. Like, we're all Muslim. Like, there's not even a choice. Like, I just am. And so even just asking the question, why would I want to, presupposes that you even have a choice in the matter, which is a very Western and even American concept to say that you even have a choice in the matter. It's not, well, this is what you're doing. Why? Because. So then why would you? And so then, so that kind of tailors into the question then, so why, as a woman, why would you want to be? Well, in Islam, women do go to heaven. They are saved. And so there is a plan of, using kind of very Christian terms, plan of salvation. There is a way to be saved, that women too are saved by their works, just like the men. And so it's a way to be saved and get into their version of the afterlife. There's that aspect. But then aside from even the spiritual aspect of it, then why is Islam growing even in the United States? And why is there kind of like free American, like land owning women, in the United States that would want to be Muslim? And why is kind of a $1 million question. And depends on the case, but I've got a few reasons that I would suppose why, but why it becomes $1 million question. Why would that be growing so rapidly here? Go ahead.
If I answer it, can I have $1 million?
If you answer, can you have $1 million? Yeah. So Darlene, would you give her $1 million for the?
So we know that in our hearts, we are created by a creator to worship God. So I think even people that are not Christians, we all have that. We want to worship something, and especially society now, to have like a concrete thing that maybe is a little cool, maybe it's against what your parents wanted you to do. I think that's a huge draw. They want to worship something. That's why we have a niece who's sure she's Hindu. They want something. We were created to worship a creator.
Absolutely. There's a natural desire inside us as human beings for the spiritual.
Yeah.
There's a natural desire and interest in the supernatural, in the what's beyond our eyes. Hence, there's so many kind of like movies and TV shows and books about supernatural stuff, because that's interesting to us. We have this natural draw to that. So there's a natural draw to it. And there's sometimes perhaps a rebellion aspect. Like, I want to believe something, but not what my parents believe. I want to do something different. Certainly an aspect of that.
So twice now you've mentioned the 70 virgins.
Yes.
Where do they come from? If every man dies and gets 70 virgins, that's a lot of virgins.
You're just doing the math. And so how's this? That's gonna go down a whole nother rabbit trail. I'm gonna save the 70 virgins thing until we get to that one. Because once we start down that trail, like, we ain't coming back. And so, which it's something good that is worthwhile to talk about, absolutely. But I'm gonna save that one for that session.
So you can see why, a lot of, I don't know, seems like people in prison, the men in prison are kind of gravitating toward Islam versus Christianity or something. And that's probably the draw right there, is the 70 virgin.
There could be some certainly some draw on that, and in prison situations you see evangelism not just by any situation, evangelists by Americans, Muslims, and others. I would say part of what, kind of go back to the women. Why would a Western, free, independent, voting, land-owning woman in the United States want to become a Muslim? I guess part of it, what I've seen, and it'd be different for every person, obviously, but part of what I've seen too is part of a reaction to things that were missing in that woman's life and childhood. And so that because in Islam, it's a very kind of clear head of the household male figure, and your husband in Islam, your husband, like, it's very strict. And again, in Islam, if you don't do enough good stuff, you go to their version of hell. And so, which is oftentimes why, like, Muslims would make good neighbors, because if they're not good neighbors, they're going to their version of hell. So they're probably not going to be having loud parties and, slinging their dog poop over the fence onto your side and stuff. Like, they're oftentimes going to make good neighbors because they have to be good to make it to their version of the afterlife. Kind of same thing with kind of like Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and stuff. They oftentimes make good neighbors because they have to be good in their religion to make it to their version of the afterlife. They have to be a good neighbor. And so in Islam, and especially in a lot of the branches of Islam that are more common in the United States, I would say there's a very clear kind of head of household structure in that the husband is there to take care of his wife and provide for his wife, and to not be stepping out on his wife, but to be faithful to her, and to stick with her till death do us part. And there's a very strict, clear, like, I'm not going to abandon you or leave you, but I'm going to stick here and stick with you, because that's a part of their faith system, that they got to do the right stuff. And so think of that from a female perspective, especially over the course of the last couple generations, where a lot of the head of household identity has been lost. And you kind of think of the average sitcom of like a family. And in the average sitcom, like which character is the goofball? Which character is the one who's like the butt of the jokes? The dad, the husband. And then kind of which is the one that's oftentimes the responsible one holding the family together? The wife. We think of just kind of like the average kind of sitcom. And so we've got like a whole generation that's been raised on this kind of understanding of head of household. And so that as a woman, if you had an absent father growing up, which is more and more common, or if you had a father who was present but was not stepping up to the plate as head of household and taking care of the family, then the thought of having somebody who's going to be there to care for you and love you unconditionally, understandably sounds good. And so I think there's also in an American context, I think there's also kind of a pendulum swing of that, to where dads and husbands not stepping up to the plate, and then a generation of girls growing up with this. I mean, like man, I want somebody that I can rely on. They're just going to be faithful to me and be there for me. And then in the Islam system, that's built in there. So that's, again, every case is different, but in broad strokes, I've been kind of seeing that demographic shift amongst Americans. And it also ties in that obviously we have Ephesians chapter 5 as our epistle reading today, talking about marriage.
Do you know, when you say, well, Islam is the fastest growing religion, but like in this country, do you know, you'd have to look at the percentage of actual people that convert to Islam versus they reproduce many children who become Muslims. I mean, the Christian people hardly have any children anymore, and they don't go to church. And along comes a Muslim couple. They have 6, 7 kids. So is the number of Muslims growing due to production, or there's a very small number of people that I've never met anybody that says I'm going to become a Muslim. Well, they're already not a Christian. We do know of a case of a girl who got in some kind of online relationship with somebody in another country that was Muslim, Pakistan, and she went there and got married and became a Muslim. That I think basically was so he could get here. And so they already have 2 kids. So, you know what I'm saying? Is it lack of?
Yeah, kind of where's the demographic numbers?
Because even if people here get married, they don't necessarily bring their kids to church and make them Christians. But the Muslims, the kids are going to be Muslims.
Yeah, and so where's part of the growth numbers coming from, both the United States and worldwide? And one of the things that's always hard with kind of the demographics numbers, is that, 63% of all statistics are made up on the spot. So.
Yeah, we got it.
And so what's hard with kind of broad scale studying broad scale demographics on like a national level too, is how do you count them and what counts? And so part of you see the exponential growth of Islam worldwide, part of that kind of demographic census counting that's oftentimes done is that once Muslims kind of come into power in a country, then the government in the country becomes Muslim, because for them, kind of the religion and the government is kind of all one and the same. So therefore, in kind of like over the course of a couple of weeks, you could have an entire country that becomes Muslim, so like kind of numbers wise, they come into power and now the whole country counts as Muslim in a lot of census numbers taking. Now, whether everybody in the country does actually convert or not, it becomes another question. And so, but kind of globally, that's kind of where you see some of the big growth too. In Africa, and the Muslims kind of take over like a country and come into power, and then now all of a sudden, however many million people in that country now count as the Muslim checkbox, on like the global census. And part of it, so that's part of it on like on a global scale, on a more individual or like our communities, or even here in the United States as well. Part of it is just sheer birth rates. And so part of it's just sheer math. And so that, when you're having triple-ish, the average birth rate, United States, where are we at now for birth rate? Is it 2.5?
Not even.
And so it's somewhere, and I can't remember where the latest birth rate in the United States is. It's not like, like in China and stuff where it's actually like negative, more people are passing away than are being born. But when your birth rate is higher, then in a couple generations, you've got a much bigger basketball team than the other guys. That's just sheer math. That's part of our demographics that we see in the United States too, just amongst different immigrants and amongst, you kind of even see like Spanish-speaking numbers, amongst kind of Hispanics, where then they oftentimes have more children.
1.66.
We're at 1.66 right now in the United States. Thank you, Google. And so then, and there's a certain tipping point there where you need to break for breaking even. And so some of it's just sheer numbers, that when you have more kids, then that's all then you multiply. So.
Well, it's just,
Depends which one you want to keep.
yeah. It could be worse in South Korea, it's 0.81. Canada's 1.43.
Right, and so that's where birth rate, and so that's where it becomes very concerning on a national scale, where your birth rate drops below, especially 1, but even you get too far below 1.5, it becomes more concerning, because you not having enough people to physically replace the other people. And we see that in like our population bubble in the United States. Baby boomers kind of coming of age, retiring. Then we have all these kind of vacuums and all these other jobs because also there's more people retiring than there is more babies being born.
Somebody needs to pay Social Security.
Right, somebody needs to keep working and paying Social Security. All right, good question.
Okay. It's something isn't computing in my brain, and I know that's a big job. Today is the anniversary of when we exited from Afghanistan. And they were talking in the news this morning about, one, that the women in Afghanistan cannot go to school. And a lot of stuff that they said in the agreement that they would allow, they didn't. When I hear the word Muslim or Islam, I think of violence. I think of Hamas and what they did. I think of the exit from Afghanistan and how horrible that was and how they treated the people. And then you're coming here and telling me that they're good neighbors. I don't see them as good neighbors. And there must be different. And then they're supposed to, if you don't believe, then aren't they supposed to kill you according to the Quran if you don't believe in the Quran? I mean, there's a disconnect here.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely right. There's a disconnect because between what I see in the headlines, which we know is always accurate. There's a disconnect between what I see in the headlines, note sarcasm. And so a disconnect between what I see in the headlines and what I might experience kind of day to day. And so it gets into what makes the headlines. And what makes the headlines now is what's always made the headlines: sex and death. I mean, how much of TV, how much of the news generates around those two things? And that's always been what's sold. You know, look back at the English Empire, look back at the Roman Empire, look at the Greeks. I mean, just go back through the ages. Those two things have always been what's put kind of seats in the amphitheater: sex and death. And so, again, and in the news too, they're a business, they need people to watch, they need to add time, so that's what they can provide for their family. And so they're going to talk about what sells, and what sells is sex and death.
But you wouldn't say that to the 13 servicemen who were killed over there.
Well, and there is violence, there is genuine violence over there and stuff too. And so then in technically by the letter of the law in the Quran, that if you commit the unforgivable sin, and we talked about that a couple of weeks ago, the unforgivable sin in Islam, shirk, is then that you say that that God is more than one, or that there's more than one aspect to God, that you deny that Allah is one. That's like their version of the unforgivable sin. If you deny that Allah is one, then that is the unforgivable sin. So hence talking about God's Son, the Son of God, the triune God, 3 in 1, that counts under shirk. And so under some strict readings of the Quran and stuff, then, if you're committing that unforgivable sin, you are outside salvation and your life is forfeit. And so in some places of the world, then that leads directly to violence. And if you study world history, those parts of the world where that leads to violence, guess what? It was bloody violence before Muslims showed up. Like this tribe was killing this tribe, was killing this tribe, has been going on, since they kind of scattered out from the Tower of Babel. And so that innate violence in those areas has been going on, since long before kind of Muslims came on the scene. Now, again, that doesn't excuse the violence. It doesn't excuse the killing over there. That's obviously still a bad and terrible thing. But that violence has been going on in that area well before kind of Islam was even a thing, well before Muhammad came on the scene. And so then sometimes then that violence then is carried out in the name of religion. And sometimes that violence is carried out in the name of Islam as well. And that gets in, we'll get into kind of jihad kind of, jihad, that's kind of since 9/11, that kind of sets off bells and whistles in some of our minds. We've got a session where we're going to get into jihad as well. And so, in some parts of the world, might is right. And in fact, in a number of parts of the world, might is right. And so whoever's carrying the biggest stick, the biggest sword, the biggest gun is who becomes president. And as soon as that person's not carrying the biggest stick, they don't get to be presidents anymore. Is how, unfortunately, a number of parts of the world work, and since sin entered the world, has always worked. And so now there's a big difference too then between kind of holy war raged amongst warring tribes in other parts of the world, and I would say the average Muslim that you and I are going to encounter on a daily basis. And so that there is, because it is a very different cultural context here in the United States, where kind of like the warring tribes, like our biggest beef with each other is kind of like which sports team you're rooting for usually, and that rarely, and that when you look at it in the context of the world, it rarely ends in what the world would consider violence. Okay, a couple of drunks getting a shoving match at the stadium, is maybe one thing, but it's not like, for generations to come, our two tribes are going to be killing each other over this. And so that's just not how things function here in our Western civilization, of which I'm grateful. I'm not complaining about that overt lack of violence in our culture. Like, I'm not complaining about that. That's a good thing. That creates for a much more stable society and economy. And so in your average American Muslim that you and I would encounter, like on a daily basis, like, no, there's not an active fear for your life. That it's not a your Muslim neighbor is going to try and get more kids than you, and then they're going to come like kill you and take over your property. No, like that's not the type of thing that we encounter, because it's a different cultural context. It doesn't even necessarily tie into like their religion as much. It's a different cultural context here in the United States. Of which I'm grateful that we don't have warring tribes, roving around the United States. I consider that a very good thing. So does that?
Yeah, I just don't trust it.
Well, and it's something too to be able to go into with open eyes and to be conscientious of. And which is also why it's good for us to take the time to actually get into what they believe and to take the time to process this.
I'm wondering, at one point they mentioned that the number of prophets was between 124,000 and 224,000. They're kind of regional. So I'm guessing that was when the world wasn't quite so mobile as it is now, because am I right in thinking that the prophet from Centerville might contradict the prophet from Hugo? I mean, this guy says it's got to be this way, and this guy says it's okay to be this way. Wouldn't that just be as confusing as possible? I could violate a law over there, not even realizing it.
Yeah, so they mentioned that there's a couple 100,000-ish, kind of depending on how you do the numbers, of prophets. There was only the 5 big messengers. Remember the 5 big messengers in Islam? Noah, Abraham, Moses, and then Jesus and Muhammad. Now Adam and David are also very important, but are oftentimes not considered one of the great prophets. But they're also, Adam and David are also considered very important as well. And so those are like the great kind of prophets. And then they came from a pool of a couple hundred-ish, kind of over the centuries, they would say, a couple 100,000-ish of messengers. And so the messengers would be more like, you could get into like Adam and David would be counted in there, Ezekiel, Jeremiah. They would claim a number of them. Prophets would be then Muslim men that come and declare that they have received a revelation or a word from Allah. So Allah spoke to me, and this is what we should do. So there's kind of like a hard and fast number on prophets, because that would include kind of any of them along throughout the centuries that have said, Allah said to me, this is what we should do. Kind of the Muslim version of the Lord spoke to me and said this.
Did they write anything down? I mean, we have parts of the Bible written down. Is the Quran like that, or?
Yeah, so then all the Quran comes from Muhammad.
So we don't have the prophets writing anything down.
And so the prophets have written things, or these other prophets throughout the centuries have written things down, like David wrote the Psalms. They've written things down, but they are not at the level of Quran. They're not at the level of Quran, and so they're like good things that are written. But they would also say that a number of the different prophets' teachings have become corrupt over time. And therefore then are not reliable. So that's, and so then with the Quran, so then it all comes from the teachings of Muhammad. And so Muhammad received these revelations from God, also from like the angel that he said was Angel Gabriel came to him. And I've come across a few different versions, and it kind of depends on the denomination. But I've come across a few different versions of kind of like what Muhammad went through. Some said that he kind of like went into like a trance and just kind of like spaced out. And then all of a sudden like words started coming out. Some said that he was kind of like shaking. Some said it was like a seizure, like a foaming at the mouth sort of thing. And then he was kind of spoke these words. There's kind of a few different versions of kind of what Muhammad was like as God was speaking to him. But then most of it comes down to that kind of once he had this covering that he kind of put over his head, then at that point, then he was speaking Allah's words. And then that's then what was to be recorded as the Quran. And so that's where the different kind of books of the Quran and teachings of the Quran would come from, would be from all from Muhammad. So it all rises and falls on Muhammad. And then what's an interesting caveat to that is that if you study those first couple of centuries after Muhammad, there was a lot of back and forth. I want to be in charge. No, I want to be in charge. No, I want to be in charge. Because by this point, like Muhammad had established like a pretty powerful army and territory and had come back and taken over Mecca. And so there was quite a back and forth of like, the nephew wants to be in charge. No, the uncle wants to be in charge. No, we should vote for who's in charge. We should go with the closest blood relative to be in charge. And as they went back and forth, whoever was in charge had their version of the Quran and would then order the destruction of the other team's versions of the Quran. So you kind of think about that for a second. And so in terms of kind of preservation, that means that there were different versions. That means that there was apparently different versions going on that were saying different things. Because if you have to destroy the other versions that disagree with your version, well, then obviously the two versions don't line up. And so that kind of also kind of feeds into kind of the historical origin of the Quran as well.
So what's actually in the Quran? We have like the Gospels and Psalms and all that. And there, is it just the sayings of Muhammad?
Yeah.
I mean, is it the law and the gospel? I mean, is that in there, or is it just what he says you should do?
Right. So what is actually in the Quran? I guess technically what's in the Quran is words. But more than that, but more than words. And so what's in, we've got kind of like the Gospels and stuff. And then what's in the Quran then is then part of it is kind of like the different, is the updated, or they would say like the fixed version of kind of like the story of the life of Jesus, is kind of included in here. I included some of like the teachings of Muhammad, we would say kind kind of like Paul's letters sort of things, like teachings. But there is also kind of part of it is also like history. That is, from a Muslim perspective, is setting the record straight on things like Noah and Abraham, and especially Jesus. You know, some of the things that's kind of, so some history things that's kind of setting the record straight, they would say, on some of those guys. But then also kind of like teachings as well. In Islam too, there's a high respect for the Quran, 100%, but a lot of it also comes down to the traditions. And then the traditions then is kind of like all the things around the Quran. And so and many of the traditions kind of carry a lot of the kind of the weight of the Quran, but they're not actually written in here as clearly. And so then the traditions then is then where a lot of like the different things in like head coverings and roles of women and stuff come into play, is what comes down to like the teachings of that, we would say, denomination, that version of Islam. But in the Quran would be kind of like the history and also kind of teaching. So kind of like what we call like gospels, and then also kind of like Paul's letters.
So they would have like something that Jesus did with miracles and stuff like that, and they'd say, he did that, but.
Right, they would say he did that. Yep, they would say, yep, Jesus did that miracle, but, or that Jesus, or Jesus was about to go to the cross. You know, like in the Quran, then it gets into, and this will be spoiler alert. Next session is Jesus. So next week we're going to start out with a video on Jesus. And so like the Quran gets into and talks about how like the great prophet Jesus was spared from the cross. And then just kind of keeps going. So obviously for us as Christians, Jesus and the cross is kind of a big deal. Jesus and the cross, that's kind of a deal breaker for us. Everything comes to Jesus on the cross. And so kind of just have like a phrase in passing, like he was spared from the cross. That just kind of keeps going. Obviously from a Christian perspective, we're like, whoa, back up. What do you mean by that? And then that's then where the different traditions come into play, is what they believe. Some would say that Jesus, some of them that I've come across would be that Jesus didn't go to the cross. So you say, well, then who was the guy that died on the cross? Because somebody did. So some would say that Jesus, it wasn't Jesus on the cross, it was one of the apostles. Or it wasn't Jesus on the cross, it was Simon from Cyrene. As you remember, then he was a guy from the crowd that got pulled to be able to carry the cross for Jesus, father of Alexander and Rufus. He was the guy who helped carry Jesus' cross out there to Golgotha. So some would say him. Some might say that like Jesus was kind of like went to the cross, but then got like pulled down and like saved at one point. That's kind of where the different traditions come in. When the traditions aren't as explicit as what's in the Quran, but the traditions is what that different denomination believes about that verse or two that might be, from our point of view, kind of general vague.
So the Quran is the absolute end of teaching. They wouldn't accept another prophet, like some really knowledgeable person in the Quran, saying that these things are wrong and that they've been interpreted wrong. And God has told me that this is what we should actually believe, and we shouldn't be so violent. I mean, if someone would come out and say that, would they accept that, or would he immediately be executed?
So what do you do? So if you've got a faith system like in Islam, that's a good question. So if you've got a faith system in Islam that says that, so you had like Noah come along, and he was a true Muslim prophet, and then he shared Allah's word, but then his teachings got corrupt and messed up. So then Abraham came along, cleared it up, and then then Ishmael and stuff, but then that got messed up. So then Moses came along and cleared it up, and that got messed up. And Jesus came, but then that got messed up. So then finally now Muhammad came and cleared that up. So then you would say, all right, so then what if another prophet, Muslim prophet, came and then says, I think the teachings of Muhammad have become messed up. This is now the true revelation that I've received from Allah. That's a great question. I've never encountered that one. From everything that since the core teaching of Islam rises and falls on Muhammad. It all rises and falls on Muhammad. And so if Muhammad is not the prophet, there is no Islam. And so that's our core teaching. Allah is one, Allah is God, and Muhammad is his prophet. And that's like their creed. And so if you don't have Muhammad, you don't have Islam. And so if somebody else came along and claiming to be a Muslim and claiming to be having the true word from Allah, I don't think hardly any aspect of Islam would accept that. It would just become a totally separate religion. Oh yeah, it would be heresy, and it'd be a totally separate religion for them. It wouldn't. Because without Muhammad, there is no Islam. Yeah, it's a good question.
Who was it that came along and wrote a book about the forbidden verses in the Quran? And right away they had a fatwa against him, and he had to go into hiding for his life. I can't remember his name, Rashadi or something like that.
Okay.
Solomon
The forbidden verses was the book he wrote.
Rushdie.
Salman Rushdie. Okay.
Salman Rushdie.
Yeah, that kind of wrote about the forbidden verses of the Quran and had to go into hiding for it and stuff.
They didn't fool around with him.
Yeah, and so, well, in that sense, Allah is one, Allah is God, and Muhammad is his prophet. That's kind of like the core teaching.
Yeah, well, this was.
And so if you mess with that,
Yeah.
I mean, that's a very, very serious sin in Islam.
Yeah.
All right.
Is he gonna talk about the other two books?
Is he going to talk about the other two books?
Yeah, I understand there's two more books besides the Quran. I heard it someplace, I don't know where,
Yeah, some of the other some of it's going to come into some of the different teachings of the denominations and kind of their centralized books, which are not like the Quran, but some of their other centralized teachings. And that's going to come up a little bit more as we're getting into more of the.
I don't remember where I see it, but I know that it's a big thick book. That's the one that gives permission to do all the stuff like cut your head off and all this stuff,
Yeah, and that comes into a lot of the traditions, would be considered the traditions of the would be of the traditions of that denomination, and that comes into kind of like the other books that they have for the different, like the Sunnis have got their own and stuff, and so that would come into the different tribes denominations would be into the other books.
I heard it was something on TV, but
Yeah.
one of Darlene's channels.
All right, and we're out of time. So what we're gonna do next week is we're gonna open up with a video about Jesus, because obviously we can't not talk about Jesus. And so, and for Muslims, Jesus is a very important prophet. And some would even go as far as to say he was like sinless, or that he was born of a virgin. And so they have a very high respect for a guy that they call Jesus. It's different than the guy we call Jesus, but they have a very high respect for him. So we're going to open up with that next week, and then there might be a few questions after the Jesus one. And there'll be definitely questions after the Jesus one, which as there should be. He's a big deal to us. All right, so great questions. Let's close here, and we'll come back with Jesus then next week. If you're able to, I invite you to stand as we close with the Lord's Prayer and the doxology. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Praise God, from whom all blessings flow. Praise him, all creatures here below. Praise him above, ye heavenly hosts. Praise Thank you.
Okay, next Sunday, we're gonna do an acapella,
Jesus is
and then all the tenors over here.
Yeah, they separate that.
I'll say before I forget on my mic volume.